One of the stories I tell in the book is about the emancipation of the Jews. Just explain exactly what I mean by that. At the dawn of the modern era, before the French Revolution, Jews all over Europe were subject to extensive legal restrictions and discriminations. They didn't have freedom of movement, they didn't enjoy any of the civic and economic rights enjoyed by the general population. And obviously not the right to vote, which was not enjoyed by the general population at that time. And you think that the story of how Jews acquired full civic and legal equality, how they became emancipated in the modern sense, would be something very central to Jewish identity in the modern world. And yet it's virtually forgotten and neglected in modern Jewish education and a lot of modern Jewish culture, at least in Britain and the United States, which is what I'm familiar with. I attended a Reform Sunday school in the United States for what seemed like an incredibly long time. I think it was about 8 years, too long for me. And in that, although it was a Reform Sunday school, and Reform itself is something that emerged in the 19th century in an attempt to modernize Judaism and Jewishness. And so Reform is itself a product of the drive for emancipation, and yet the story of our own legal emancipation was completely left out of my Jewish education. We learned more about Hasidism, which is the folk religion of Eastern Europe, than we did about Haskalah, which is the Jewish secular enlightenment, even though we were all products of the Haskalah, of the process of emancipation. My existence, the existence of all the other Jews you've ever met in this society, is entirely dependent on the story of emancipation. Now, there are a couple of reasons why it's neglected. One is that it was a very prolonged and piecemeal process. It starts in 1789 with the French Revolution, but it's not completed until 1917 with the Russian Revolution, which finally eliminates the legal restrictions on Jews in the old Tsarist Empire. And another reason why it's often neglected is that it doesn't fit in with the Zionist narrative. Because remember, the Zionist narrative says that emancipation can never be complete, that Jews will never be fully at home in Western societies or European societies, and therefore have to have a country of their own somewhere else. And it's in the vested interest of Zionism to deny the efficacy and reality of the drive for emancipation, which is actually the real basis of Jewish existence in the present world. You wouldn't have Zionism, which is a secular ideology essentially, though based on a religious identity. You wouldn't have that if you hadn't had the process of emancipation and Jewish political participation in the wider world first. And the other reason that the story of emancipation is so dreadfully neglected is that it wasn't just a struggle against anti-Semitism, although it was certainly that. It was also a struggle within the Jewish community. The progressive Jews who wanted full emancipation, full equality, often found that they had to fight against the entrenched rabbinical and traditional communal powers in the Jewish community, because those powers feared that Jewish equality, Jewish emancipation, would lead to them losing control over the Jewish community. This is by no means a story restricted to Jews. It can be found with many, many ethnic minority groups. And because of these factors, because the story of emancipation flies in the face of several messages that the Jewish establishment wants us to imbibe about our Jewishness, they fail to tell us about it. So I went back and did quite a bit of reading about it. I found it hugely fascinating, and I discovered an unsung Jewish hero named Zoltan Horvitz, who was a Polish Jew who moved to Paris and found himself in Paris in 1789 at the time of the Revolution. And he was an advocate of Enlightenment values. He was inspired by Voltaire, even though Voltaire was himself a Arabian anti-Semite. Zoltan Horvitz said that he as a Jew would forgive Voltaire his anti-Semitism for all the other good things he'd done, for the spirit of tolerance and rationality in general. And I think actually that's an attitude toward Voltaire we can take today. And Horvitz became an activist in the French Revolution, and he was the greatest champion of the emancipation of the Jews. What he wanted to see was the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man, which is kind of the founding document of the French Revolution, extended explicitly to cover both Jews and black people, both of whom were not explicitly liberated by the initial declaration. And so Horvitz, from 1789, 1790, 1791, runs a vigorous campaign in Paris where he mobilizes not merely the Jews in Paris, who were few in number, but the revolutionary populace in Paris and Sans-Culottes in general to support Jewish emancipation. And this was the vanguard of Jewish emancipation. These people in Paris, Jewish and non-Jewish, were the cutting edge of the fight for equality for Jews, for blacks, and others at this time. Now, Horvitz ran up against entrenched opposition, obviously from anti-Semitic, and there were plenty of supporters of the French Revolution who were anti-Semitic and who did not accept that the Jews had a right to be part of the French nation. But he also ran up against opposition from the Jewish leaders, particularly in Metz, in eastern France, which was the largest concentration of Jewish population at that time. Because while they welcomed some of the reforms that were promised by emancipation, they were uneasy about it because it threatened to undermine their own power over the community. A very specific example is this, that they were hesitant to agree to the idea that Jews should have freedom of movement, because under the old regime, Jews had to get permission to go anywhere. It was a pass law system. And under the new laws that Horvitz was advocating, Jews would move around France just like any other French person. And they didn't like this, the rabbis and the leaders of the Metz community, because the restrictions on Jewish movement kept the rents in the ghetto artificially high, and the owners of the property in the ghetto were themselves wealthy Jews and rabbis. And so they stood to lose from the full emancipation of the Jews. And there are many other examples of that kind. In 1791, a delegation from Metz, representing the conservative traditional leaders of the Jewish community, turned up to speak to the Revolutionary Assembly in Paris. And Horvitz was furious, and he wrote to his fellow revolutionaries on the assembly in great impatience, saying, haven't I told you enough about these people that you should know that they don't represent what they claim to represent. They don't speak for all Jews as they claim to speak for all Jews. And you should be listening to people like me, like Horvitz, who are revolutionary and democratic Jews. And when I read this, I very much strongly identified with Horvitz. And I think any progressive Jew in our era would, because again and again and again, we are faced with the Board of Deputies of British Jews, with the Zionist organizations, the Union of Jewish Students, claiming to speak for all of us, and somehow being recognized by the media and by officials of the government as the prime and exclusive spokespersons for Jews today, when they are no such thing at all.